Tonight's meeting will share background information, the 6 cleanup options, and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's recommended cleanup plan for Ford Area C. We have dedicated time at the end of the main presentation to answer your questions. I also want to point out that MPCA hosted an in-person meeting last week on January 15th at the Highland Park Community Center. Maybe you were attending that one as well. This will be the same presentation. We had about 100 attendees at that meeting, and people asked great questions, so we look forward to continue to answer your questions tonight. Before I share the agenda, I want to start off with introductions. My name is Sammy Maldonado. I'm a Community Affairs Associate at the MPCA, and I'll help facilitate this meeting. I'll pass it on to the remediation team to introduce themselves.
Tonight, I'm Amy Hadieris. I'm the presenter for tonight, and I'm the supervisor of the cleanup program that oversees the work at Area C.
And good evening, I'm Shauna Schmidt. I work with Amy on the Ford site, including Area C, and I've been with the PCA for a while now, and yeah, we look forward to answering your questions.
Good evening, my name is Hans Navy. I'm a manager at Pollution Control Agency.
Hello, my name is Pam Anderson. I am the Remediation Division Director.
Awesome, thank you. So in the next slide, we'll have an agenda. And the purpose of tonight's meeting is to share information, encourage you all to submit public comments, and answer your questions. We recognize that there may be diverse perspectives in this virtual meeting space. So again, we appreciate you taking the time to be part of this meeting, and we look forward to sharing more information tonight. We'd like to create a respectful, informative, and worthwhile meeting for everyone joining today. So to do so, we have meeting norms and an agenda we'd like to share so you all know what to expect tonight. I mentioned earlier, but just to repeat it, this meeting is being recorded and it will be posted on MPCA's webpage. An MPCA staff member will step in if at any time the questions that we have later become disruptive, or we'll let you know if they're out of the scope for tonight's meeting or not focused on Ford Area C. In a moment, I'll pass it over to Amy, who will give a presentation about Ford Area C. Amy will cover topics of history of waste disposal, environmental investigation, the roles of Ford Motor Company and MPCA, feasibility study and the 6 cleanup alternatives, MPCA's recommendation, community acceptance, and lastly, the public comment and next steps. Once the presentation wraps up at about 7:20 p.m., we'll move into the Q&A. MPCA staff members want to answer your questions, which is why we designated nearly an hour, about an hour to answer questions tonight. So the next slide, I have some information on how the Q&A process will work, just so you know what to expect once we do get to the Q&A at about 7:20. There are, our main goals with the Q&A are to provide clarity and transparency to your questions. And we also want to answer as many questions as possible tonight, which I think we'll be able to do since we have not too many attendees. There are 2 options for you to ask questions, and you can choose whichever you prefer. The first option is to type your questions. So on the WebEx screen, at the bottom right, you should see a button that says Apps. You can click the Apps button and locate the Slido app. It's this green S logo that you can see on the screen. So once you find that green S logo, you know you're in the right spot for the Q&A. You'll see a text box. Click in the text box, type your question, and then be sure to click the send button to send us that question. We ask that you submit your questions individually rather than include multiple questions in one message, just so it helps us stay organized of what questions are coming in. During the Q&A session, we'll have a staff member read the questions out loud. And once we've read the question will be made visible for all participants to view. The second option is for you to ask a question verbally. So currently you'll see that your microphone is automatically muted to help prevent any accidental unmuting. But when we start the Q&A, if you would like to verbally ask your question, you can click on the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. It's this hand icon. I'll then call on you and I'll unmute you so you can verbally ask your question. To be fair to everyone, we ask that you ask one question per hand raise. So if you have another question, feel free to raise your hand again, and we'll make sure we get through, again, as many questions as possible. We will alternate equally between the typed questions and the verbal questions. We'll take the final question at about 8:25 tonight. Our contact information will be shared after the Q&A, so you're more than welcome to contact us if you have further questions. After the closing remarks, the meeting will end at 8:30. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen to these meeting norms, our agenda, and I will pass it over to Amy to give her presentation.
Okay. Thank you, Sammy. So just to get oriented, here is the large Ford redevelopment site. This is Mississippi River Boulevard, and then there's a steep drop-off off the bluff and down to the floodplain where Area C is located. And Area C is just a name that Ford Motor Company gave this former industrial waste dump. This view was taken by a drone in about 2015. You can see that all the structures on the main redevelopment parcel have been removed, but the soil cleanup had not yet occurred. And then over here, you can see the parking lot and the wooded slopes that cover Area C. I'm going to make a few opening remarks before we dig into the rest of the slides. The dumping that occurred here at Area C is egregious by today's standards, but it was commonplace back then. At that time, there were no regulations for waste disposal. And I mention this just to convey that the historical waste disposal at Area C, excuse me, is not an enforcement issue, as no laws or rules were broken by the disposal of that waste. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that prior to the late 1970s, the dump did have an impact on the river. At that time, during that period, the waste would have been exposed to the elements. Contaminated soil would have washed into the river, and floodwaters would have carried waste downstream. Now, that's not the situation that exists today. The environmental investigation that has been completed and 10 years of data show that the waste in its current covered condition poses minimal environmental impact. Now, some level of cleanup is certainly needed and appropriate. I understand that many people have strong feelings about the agency requiring complete removal of all the waste at Area C, but given the minimal environmental impact, complete removal is not a legally defensible requirement for the agency. So we're going to use the following slides just to delve deeper into that story. That was just kind of an overview. And we'll start with the history of waste disposal. Good place to start. So the MPCA found out about Area C in late 1980 through an anonymous phone call. It said, during the 1950s, near the Ford plant, waste solvents from the plant's painting operation were dumped over the steep bluff overlooking the river, and waste in barrels was buried. So it turns out that it actually started in the mid-1940s to the mid-1960s. That's when Ford disposed of its industrial waste at Area C. Now, there are no records describing how that waste was disposed, as is typical of that time, but the phone call just mentioned does provide some insight possibly into what happened. And it does sound like liquids were just dumped over the bluff and they would have seeped into the ground. And paint sludge, which is more viscous, would have been placed in metal barrels and buried. So that went on till about 1965. Now, also in the 1960s, Ford did a few construction projects up on its main parcel. And when they were excavating for those construction projects, they ran into some contaminated soil, they generated some debris, and they also added that material on top of Area C. So there the dump sat for a while until the late 1970s, early 1980s, when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers reconstructed Lock and Dam number 1, otherwise known as the Ford Dam. And they disposed of all this concrete rubble, big concrete blocks the size of cars, and sand on top of and around the industrial waste. Following that, in the mid-1980s, Ford covered the top of that construction rubble pile with a paved parking lot that we saw in that drone photo, and they used that parking lot to store finished trucks that were waiting to be shipped out via rail. And then finally, in the late 1980s, the city of St. Paul placed some rubble at the site when they reconstructed Mississippi River Boulevard. So Area C has or the Ford site in general has an early history with the MPCA. In 1984, the larger Ford site was listed on our state Superfund list because of 3 old dump sites. 2 of those old dump sites were on the main parcel, and then Area C on the river parcel was the 3rd dump site. And so from 1980s to the early 1990s, those 3 dumps were investigated. I'm not going to talk about the 2 dumps on the main parcel. Those were dealt with during the redevelopment cleanup. We'll focus tonight on Area C. So groundwater monitoring at Area C during these early years showed no significant impact. And there was a limited surface cleanup at Area C during that time. Some superficial debris was removed. There was some netting put down on the south slope, and some clean fill was placed over that. And then in 1993, the Ford site was delisted and is no longer a Superfund site. So the Ford site hasn't been a Superfund site for over 30 years. So what spurred on this more recent environmental investigation at Area C? And well, that was when the Ford plant closed down in 2011 and with pending plans for redevelopment. In addition to the environmental investigation on the main parcel, we wanted to take a fresh look at Area C as well. So the first important task was to figure out where is the buried industrial waste, because you can't see it. I know a lot of people have gone out there and walked around and seen this big pile. It's got some debris and everything like that, but that's not the industrial waste. You can't see the industrial waste because it's deeply buried. But we can figure it out by doing some drilling, some soil borings. And so the first step was that 10 soil borings, each one represented by this orange dot, were drilled through the parking lot and all the way down through the construction fill, about 80 to 100 feet, generally, most of these soil borings. And they either hit the industrial waste or they didn't. And so what we discovered was that the borings in this area all did hit some industrial waste at depth, and then none of these borings did. So we defined the limits of the industrial waste to be kind of the half of the parking lot that's closest to the bluff. So up here is Mississippi River Boulevard. Over here is Hidden Falls Regional Park. And then the river is down here, although you can't see it. It's outside the frame of the picture. So the industrial waste is about 40 to 60 feet below the parking lot. So in other words, during the drilling, we went through this concrete slab, about 40 to 60 feet down. We're just going through all that construction fill, and then boom, we hit the industrial waste. And just to give you an idea of what it looked like, it was like a black, very smelly sand with debris in it. It was very obvious when you hit that industrial waste layer. It was very visually distinct from the overlying construction fill. And the average thickness of that industrial waste layer was about 25 feet. Now, it was thicker here near the bluff where the kind of active dumping occurred, and then it kind of sloped down until you get to this part. It was kind of just a couple feet thick. So that is what we found out from the drilling investigation. And just to show you a cross section of what I was just talking about, if you were to cut Area C in half lengthwise, and then step back and take a look at the cut surface, kind of like looking at half of a birthday cake, this is what you would see. It's called a cross section. Now these red polka dots, that represents solid rock. We call that bedrock. The Mississippi River Boulevard is up here. The Mississippi River is over here. All of this sand is naturally occurring sand that was deposited there by the river. And then here's that industrial waste that we talked about. It's under about half the parking lot, the half that's closest to the bluff. And it's covered and surrounded by all this construction fill. And then there's the parking lot. So the other benefit of doing those soil borings is that in addition to figuring out where the waste is, it allows us to collect samples of that waste so that we can find out what the contamination is. And so what we discovered is that the industrial waste is contaminated with solvents that were used in the painting process. And these are, there's different kinds of solvents, used for different purposes. These particular solvents are kind of the same chemicals that are present in gasoline. Heavy metals from paint pigment. Now different paints get their colors from different heavy metals. So there's antimony, arsenic, copper, lead. Lead was kind of the main offender here at Area C. On some of the concentrations of the waste did have hazardous concentrations of lead in some samples. And then occasional samples had low PCBs, again, associated with the paint pigment. This picture is a barrel that we uncovered during a trenching operation at Area C. And on the next slide, I'll show you where we found that. But I wanted to take this opportunity just to mention that this barrel is probably the best preserved barrel that we found at Area C. The paint waste was put into metal barrels. And again, this is a very wet environment, it was on the floodplain and exposed to the elements for many years. And so just these steel barrels disintegrated, rusted, and weakened greatly. And then that was compounded by all of that weight being put on the dump through all the deposition of all that sand and the concrete. So it's very unlikely that any intact barrels remain at Area C. Most of the time when we saw signs of barrels, they were just mangled pieces of flattened metal. So again, this is kind of the best preserved one of the bunch. And all the barrels that we found were empty, not because they were empty when they were put there, but because most of the waste has been removed or extruded from the barrels, given their poor condition. So this slide shows the location of some test trenches that were dug into the south slope. Each test trench is represented by this green line. Again, this is Hidden Falls Regional Park right here, Mississippi River Boulevard up here, and the river down here. You can just see a sliver of that. And so these trenches confirmed what we learned from the drilling investigation, and that the industrial waste is close to the bluff, but doesn't extend, down halfway past the parking lot here. So these two trenches, we did encounter industrial waste in the trenches. This one, and then these two down here, we did not. So again, it just kind of confirms the picture that the industrial waste is all consolidated in this area. Now, I mentioned that under the parking lot, the industrial waste is 40 to 60 feet below that concrete slab. But that's not the case over here. When we were doing these trenches, we encountered paint waste and that barrel that was just on the previous photo, just about 2 feet below the ground surface. So in this area, the industrial waste is close to the surface. It's not covered by a lot of soil. It's not covered by the parking lot. The other thing that this figure shows are these lime green dots. And each dot is the location of a soil sample that was just grabbed from the surface of the slope. Now, these samples don't have anything to do with industrial waste because there's no industrial waste, exposed on those slopes, but rather we just wanted to sample the construction fill to see, okay, well, people do trespass at Area C. What are they walking on? Is there a concern just from the exposed soil on the slopes? And what we found is that all of that exposed soil on the slopes is just typical urban fill. No surprises there and no concerns. It's the kind of stuff you see all along the river and really on many properties throughout the Twin Cities. So now that we know where the waste is, how deep it is, what's the contamination, we can answer the question, is there a risk to people? And so MPCA asked the Minnesota Department of Health to do an independent risk review of current conditions at Area C. And MDH concluded that only minimal risks exist if trespassers contact contaminants in that surface soil or physical hazards from the surface debris. And by physical hazards, I mean like rusty metal sticking up, tripping over concrete debris, that kind of thing. Because the industrial waste is buried, people walking on the site are not exposed to the waste or harmful amounts of contaminants. And if you want to delve into that a little more deeply, MDH's 2020 health risk assessment is posted on our MPCA Area C webpage, so you can look at that and read the whole thing. Now, certainly with the Mississippi River being so close, investigation of groundwater is an important component of the investigation. And so this figure here shows the extent of industrial waste in this orange area that we identified through the combination of the soil borings and the trenches. And each of these circles represents a monitoring well. And in areas where there's 2 circles or 3 circles clustered together, that means that there's 2 monitoring wells or 3 monitoring wells right at that location. And that allows us to sample groundwater at different vertical depths. So there, like in this area here, there would be a shallow groundwater sample, a mid-depth groundwater sample, and then a groundwater sample deeper, like collected from the bedrock. So this is a robust monitoring network. There are 20 wells altogether and allowed us to get samples of groundwater from different vertical depths. And what did we find here? Let's see. So results from 10 years of groundwater monitoring. There's not a whole lot of groundwater contamination out there. No contaminated groundwater is discharging to the river. The contamination is limited to shallow groundwater close to the south slope. And I'm going to just jump back one slide to show you right here. One of these wells is marked in red, and that's the well that generally has had the most contamination in it. And that's not surprising because if you recall, this is where we identified through the test trenches that there is paint waste very close to the surface there, just 2 feet under the ground. And so it makes sense that, rainwater, whatever would be able to percolate into the soil and contaminate groundwater in that area. So the contaminated groundwater is limited to shallow groundwater close to that south slope. Even in that area, the concentrations are much less than what would pose a risk to the river. And we know the contamination is not moving downward into deeper groundwater. And in fact, groundwater in this area is strongly moving upward. So it would be impossible for contamination to move downward. Now one question about the groundwater situation is, okay, well, what I just talked about was your typical groundwater situation when the river is at its normal level, right? So here, this cross section, this is the same cross section that you saw before, but now we're showing we're showing 3 different blue dashed lines here. And this bottom dashed line is the typical level of groundwater underneath Area C when the river is at its typical level. Now, when the river floods, the water level under Area C rises and falls pretty much in tandem with the river. And again, that's because this is a very porous sand. And as the river goes up, this water table goes up. And as the river goes back down, this also goes back down. And so a 10-year flood event, the water table or the groundwater underneath the waste rises up and intersects the bottom of the waste. In a 100-year flood, that water level under the waste rises even more and it actually saturates, the bottom of that waste pile. So 2 monitoring events were completed like right after after 2 flood events. So we had 2 flood events and sampled those monitoring wells right after the flood event to see what effect that water table rising up into the industrial waste might have on the groundwater quality. And it really didn't show an increase in contamination. And I have my theory about that. I think that this has happened so much over time. This waste has been there for over 80 years. There's been a lot of up and down of the water table, kind of flushing a lot of those contaminants out. So I wasn't too surprised by that, but the data did show that there wasn't any surge of groundwater contamination after the flood events. So this slide is just a recap of investigation results. The buried industrial waste is contaminated with solvents, metals, and PCBs. Most of the industrial waste, except for that south slope, is covered by 40 to 60 feet of soil and a concrete parking lot. MDH concluded that only minimal risks exist if trespassers contact contaminants in surface soil or physical hazards from debris. The groundwater contamination is limited to shallow groundwater close to the south slope, and no contaminated groundwater is discharging to the river. So that's what the investigation told us. I wanted to just comment briefly on the roles of Ford and MPCA in this process. So what is Ford's role? Well, Ford is the property owner and decides how Area C is to be used, as all private property owners get to do, subject to zoning regulations and whatnot. And Ford intends to retain ownership of Area C in its current condition, as an industrial property. Ford is responsible for investigating and cleaning up Area C within existing state and federal legal and policy frameworks. Ford paid for that environmental investigation and will pay for the cleanup as well. And Ford will have ongoing responsibility to inspect, monitor, and maintain Area C after the cleanup to make sure that the cleanup remains protective. So the take-home point there is that they don't just complete a cleanup now and walk away, never to be seen again. They do have to stay engaged and continue to inspect, monitor, and maintain Area C. Now, our role, MPCA's role, is to provide technical and regulatory oversight for the investigation and cleanup. It's our responsibility to choose a cleanup alternative that's based on science and data that will be protective of people in the river, and this is important, that balances the scope of cleanup relative to the risk. And we're going to talk more about that in a little bit when we talk about the feasibility study. Another thing we do is we review Ford's post-cleanup inspection and monitoring reports to make sure the cleanup remains protective. And if conditions change, MPCA would require additional action to address any changed conditions if the cleanup that was completed is no longer protective. So feasibility study and cleanup alternatives. And this document is available on our website for you to look at the whole thing at your leisure. It can be a little bit hard to digest. It's a feasibility study follows a very specific format, and every feasibility study that you look at kind of follows the same format, but it is a little bit difficult to comprehend sometimes. So we're pleased to provide just a general overview for you this evening. So what is the feasibility study? It's a document that presents 6 cleanup alternatives for Area C. And each of these 6 alternatives are evaluated using a required set of US EPA criteria. And bulleted below are those criteria. So protection of people and the environment, legal compliance, effective impermanence, reduction of toxicity, mobility, or volume, feasibility to implement, and the cost. So how are the cleanup options evaluated? It's kind of a phased approach. The first thing that's done is to evaluate each alternative against these threshold criteria, and there's 2 of them: overall protection of human health and the environment, and then legal compliance. And if an option does not meet either of those criteria, it does not move forward for further evaluation, right? So these are primary threshold criteria. if the alternative doesn't pass muster, then we just kind of don't pay any more mind. If these two threshold criteria are met, then we move on to say, okay, how does that alternative stack up against the balancing criteria? And again, we look at all of these things. There's not one thing that carries the day here. We look at each of these things and all of these things relative to the risk that is present at the site to choose a cleanup alternative that is protective and also balanced against the risk. So this is how the cleanup alternative is chosen, by looking at all these kind of technical criteria relative to the risk based on the investigation that was done. And then we move over here to community acceptance. Community acceptance follows the selection of the proposed alternative. So this is kind of where we're at now. And we're going to talk more about community acceptance and what that means in a little bit. But for right now, I just want to say that community acceptance does not override the balancing criteria. So it's not a vote, and that can be kind of a hard message for people to hear. We'll talk more about what community acceptance means in the slides to follow. So what we're going to do now is we're going to step through each of those 6 alternatives just to see how they stack up against these criteria. So alternative 1 was just called no action alternative. And basically that means, hey, we'll just leave it the way it is. Now that's nothing that Ford is proposing or would propose. It's a no action alternative appears in every feasibility study. It's a required alternative, and it really just serves as a baseline for comparison to other alternatives. And leaving it as is, no action, well, that's not protective of human health of the environment, because we know we have paint waste and stuff just a couple feet below the ground surface on the south slope. And for that same reason, it doesn't meet our policy and our relevant requirements. So does not meet. And so, as I mentioned before, if something doesn't meet the threshold criteria, we just dispense with it, and we don't consider it any further. Alternative 2 is called site stabilization, and you can think of that as just stabilizing all the slopes from erosion. This also doesn't meet threshold criteria because, again, for the same reason, it's really not addressing the shallow waste that's present on the south slope. It would leave that industrial waste within the upper 4 feet on the south slope. And so we just remove this from further consideration as well. So of the 6 alternatives that are in the feasibility study, we've already dispensed with 2 of them. Alternative 3 is called clean buffer and site stabilization. So that's site stabilization, meaning let's deal with that erosion problem out there, but also let's do some excavation to establish a clean buffer on the slopes. And so this alternative proposes to make a 4-foot clean buffer on the south slope. And 4 feet was chosen because that's a typical vertical buffer that the MPCA uses at remediation sites to be protective of people using that property, walking on that property. So this is protective of human health and the environment, and it does meet our routine requirements for a 4-foot vertical buffer. So this can move on to the balancing criteria. So here's alternative 3 balancing criteria. And alternative 3, it does remove waste on the south slope, but just to a depth of 4 feet. And so it doesn't really reduce the mobility of contamination there on the south slope. Remember, I talked about how there's some groundwater contamination off that south slope due to the shallow waste that is present there. And if there's waste left at a depth greater than 4 feet, then that's still a source for groundwater contamination in that area. This is another thing we look at, minimal short-term risks during implementation. And what that means is that, You know, every time we do a cleanup at a contaminated site, there are potential environmental impacts just from doing that cleanup, you know, whether it's big trucks going through the community, you know, belching exhaust and greenhouse gases, or whether it's air pollution from dust or chemical vapors. In this case, being so close to the river, there would be the potential of, you know, contaminated sediment washing into the river during active excavation in that area. So this, we say, okay, it's minimal risk because really they're not removing that much waste with alternative 3. The cost of alternative 3, the costs are all in the feasibility study. That's some costs that the environmental contractors developed for these alternatives. And this is Ford's recommended alternative, is alternative 3. Alternative 4, removal of accessible waste and site stabilization. So this is just like alternative 3, except it's removing more waste from the south slope. This alternative does meet the threshold criteria, and so we move it forward to the balancing criteria. And alternative 4 would remove as much industrial waste on the south slope as possible without causing the slope to collapse, basically. Moderate short-term risks during implementation, and that's just because there's going to be more disturbance in kind of a sensitive area down there. I should point out that while any cleanup action can have short-term environmental impacts while it's being implemented, there are standard ways to manage that. So we don't not do a cleanup just because the cleanup itself might have a potential impact. There are many standard approaches to manage and prevent those environmental impacts during cleanup. So the cost of alternative 4 was $8.8 million. And this is the alternative that MPCA recommends. Alternative 5, we're almost done, folks, so hang in there. There's only 6 of them. Alternative 5 is putting a cover over all the waste. That would be protective. You know, it prevents people from contacting any of the waste, but it really doesn't meet the legal regulations down there. It would require bringing in a lot of fill to fill the floodplain in order to create the slopes and the cover needed to accomplish this alternative. And so it doesn't meet both of the threshold criteria, and we remove this from further consideration. And finally, the last one, alternative 6, removal of all waste and site restoration. Well, these certainly meet the threshold criteria, so we're going to move it forward to the balancing criteria. Alternative 6 removes all of the industrial waste and overlying construction fill. Significant short-term risks during implementation. Again, that's just because this is a massive excavation effort, lots of disturbance down there in a sensitive area. I should point out that alternatives 3 and 4, that's Ford's recommended alternative for alternative 3, and then the MPCA's alternative 4. And well, each of those would take probably about a year to accomplish. Alternative 6 here would probably take about 3 years. Cost is $71 million. So as I mentioned before, the scope of work here is not balanced relative to the risk. So the minimal environmental impact at Area C does not support the agency choosing alternative 6. This slide just summarizes how each of those alternatives stack up against the threshold criteria. Alternatives 1, 2, and 5 were all removed. Alternatives 3, 4, and 6 were carried forward to the balancing criteria. And really the only difference between alternatives 3, 4, and 6 is the volume of waste, the volume of industrial waste that's removed at the site. So alternative 3, kind of a minimal removal, just focusing on the upper 4 feet. Alternative 4, a more robust excavation of waste on the south slope. And then alternative 6 removes everything. So a little bit more information about MPCA's recommendation. On the left here, we see alternative 3, which is Ford's proposal. And then on the right, alternative 3 is Ford's proposal. On the right, alternative 4 is MPCA's proposal. So the hatched area shows the proposed excavation areas for the industrial waste. And so you can see that alternative 3, they're really focusing on just like at the very toe of that slope. So of kind of a limited excavation area. On alternative 4, we would like to see them take a more aggressive approach on that south slope and remove as much of the industrial waste as they can without causing the concrete slab to collapse up there. And then following that excavation, they would backfill the slope with clean soil and install a robust riprap, which is kind of rocks embedded into the slope to stabilize that from erosion. So we chose alternative 4 because it appropriately balances the scope of the cleanup relative to the risk. And that's a key point. If there was a significant environmental impact at Area C, then alternative 6 might be the way to go. Because there's a significant impact and a very robust scope of cleanup is necessary to manage that impact, to address it. But that's not the case here. So minimal environmental impact doesn't warrant that huge response action. So the reason alternative 4 works is because digging into the south slope will remove that buried industrial waste that is causing that localized groundwater contamination. It's going to remove the physical hazards from all slopes, not just the south slope, but from all slopes, to address safety concerns and improve the appearance of Area C. And then all the slopes will be stabilized with riprap up to the 100-year flood elevation to address the erosion problem. So alternative 4 focuses the cleanup efforts in the areas of greatest concern. So talking a little bit more about community acceptance. This is the same slide you saw before. I just wanted to remind you that here we are right now, community acceptance. So what does community acceptance mean? It doesn't mean we prefer this and not that. It's a way for the community to weigh in with their concerns to make sure that the concerns have been considered. So we're looking to the community to say, are there community concerns that haven't been considered in this process? It could be that there's a different alternative preferred by the community that achieves that same relative balance between the selection criteria. Well, if that's the case, if it achieves that same relative balance between risk and the scope of the cleanup, then, maybe that's a cause for changing the alternative. And then finally, can some aspect of the proposed cleanup be designed to address a community concern? So an example of that third bullet would be, a lot of times, well, almost always when there's a cleanup of contaminated soil going on, that contaminated soil has to be loaded up into big trucks, and then those big trucks need to make their way to a permitted landfill to dispose of that contaminated soil. And they need to go through communities to do that. And so a lot of times folks in the community have a concern about, well, what hours are these trucks going to be rolling through our neighborhood? And, what roads will they be on? And so, there's a plan in place to say, okay, the trucks can only be going through a neighborhood between, in this time frame, and they can't just go on any road. There's a designated route for the trucks, to kind of minimize that neighborhood disturbance. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking for here. We will choose a cleanup alternative that is based on science and is consistent with the long-standing risk-based framework used by MPCA, by other states, and by the US EPA. So all of the environmental agencies that make cleanup decisions for contaminated sites, we rely on this risk-based framework. We choose a cleanup alternative that takes care of the risk in a way that's balanced with the risk. The scope of the cleanup is balanced against the risk. So public comment and next steps. So the public comment period is still open. It started on November 5th and it runs to February 3rd. Public comments, we can certainly hear your comments and questions tonight, but to be considered formally during the public comment period, it has to be submitted in writing, either through our online comment page or by US mail. And that online comment page can be accessed through our MPCA Area C webpage. There's a QR code there. And here's the link here down below, or the string. We will review and evaluate all comments, and we will respond to comments by mid-March is our goal. If you provide an email address with your comment, and you don't have to, but if you do, we will also send the response to you via email. If you choose to not provide your email address, you would just have to log back into that comment page to see the response to your comment, which will be posted there. So what makes an effective public comment? It's when you share a specific concern that hasn't been considered. Maybe you have new data, new information that we didn't know about, and we should evaluate that in order to make the best decision that we can. Or maybe you identify an aspect of the proposed cleanup alternative that may need further review. And I can give you an example of that. Actually, there's an organization that is reviewing the feasibility study, and they have expressed a concern about, with either alternative 3 or 4, they've expressed a concern about the steepness of the slopes that will remain after that cleanup alternative is completed. And so they're saying, hey, we think that needs further review. And so that's the focus of their comment. And so how will the agency handle that? Well, we'll be reaching out to Ford and say, hey, you need to share your engineering analysis, for example, to show that the slope that will remain is going to be sustainable in the long run. So that's an example of how that process works. General opposition or support and opinions do not lead to change. As I mentioned before, it's not a vote based on how many people prefer this versus how many people prefer that. It's a more scientific based approach that we use here. So comments are not votes. We're not authorized to act on opinions or unsupported claims, but effective comments that include that actionable information and address the proposal's environmental impacts can and do improve our final decisions. So timeline and next steps. Well, the investigation is over, 2015 to 2024. That answered the question, where is the contamination and what are the risks? We received the feasibility study in October of 2025. We're nearing the end of the public comment period, and typically our comment periods are 30 days. In this case, we did extend it to 90 days just because of the timing of when the feasibility study was submitted and the conflicted with holiday season there. So we made it 90 days to allow people more time to get familiar with it. We've had, as Sammy mentioned earlier, we had a in-person public meeting on the 15th, and then here we are tonight with our webinar. And in 2026, MPCA will select the cleanup plan, and then Ford will develop a detailed design plan for implementation. So all of the cleanup alternatives, as they're described in the feasibility study, are very high level. It says, here's what we'll do, but it doesn't say here's how we'll do it. So once a final cleanup plan is selected, Ford will have to develop a detailed plan to tell us how they're going to implement that. And then in 2027, Ford will implement the cleanup. So again, alternatives 3 and 4 would take 1 year. Alternative 6 would take about 3 years. So that's the end of the presentation, and we're going to go into our question and answer period. And so I'm going to turn it back to Sammy. I will we have this this slide here too, which is kind of a reminder for you in terms of how you want to ask your question. We'll leave that showing for a while. So Sammy, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. So as Amy said, we'll transition into the Q&A. As a reminder, this is a Q&A session and an opportunity for you all to ask your questions about Ford Area C. Amy mentioned that the public comment period is open until February 3rd, 2026. So the public comment is where you can go into more detail on potentially data, sources, new information, or concerns that MPCA may not be aware of. Please make sure you submit those public comments in writing or on the form or by mail to formally submit the public comment. And I know we had some people join in after I shared the Q&A process, so just want to do a quick reminder and give you time to think of questions in the next couple minutes. But there's two options for you to share your questions. The first option is to type your question. On your WebEx screen, you should see a button that says Apps, or you can look for this green S logo. And that is the Slido area where you can type your question in a text box and click Send. The second option is to verbally ask a question. So you'll see a raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen. You can click that icon and I will let you know when I'm going to unmute you for you to verbally share your question. All right, so I'm going to give you all time to think of questions, put them in the Slido or to raise your hand, and let me see if we have any hands raised yet. All right, I see some text questions coming in, so Joel will help moderate those.
Thanks, Sammy. I'll do two. First one was answered. It was the first one that came in is how many attendees are at this meeting. We have a total of 11 members from the public who have checked into this meeting. The next one I'll open up to our panel. First question is, whose responsibility was it to prevent this pollution in the first place?
Yeah, so back then the PCA didn't even exist, right? So this historical waste disposal, as I mentioned with my opening remarks, this is kind of how our society managed industrial waste in the past. It was very common. We call these legacy contamination sites because it's kind of a legacy from bad days in our past, right? When this is how people disposed of their industrial waste. This is what companies did all the time. So I think it's challenging, like to apply our current knowledge and our current process, back to behavior that happened, a good 80 years ago, when there were no laws and there were no regulations about waste disposal. All of that stuff came later.
And we will, anyone else have something to add to that? Or move on? Okay. We'll be alternating between the verbal questions and written ones. I don't see any hands raised at the moment, so we'll move on to another written question there.
Thanks. Next one is, how does your cleanup plan selection take into consideration Superfund and Brownfield/VIC?
Yeah, so Superfund and VIC, we call that, VIC for short. That stands for Voluntary Investigation and Cleanup Program. These are two different cleanup programs within the remediation division. We all use the same process for risk evaluation and how to do an investigation and how do we evaluate that data and how do we choose a cleanup alternative, based on the risk. So the processes are all the same. The main difference is Superfund is usually dealing with it's a responsible parties, and then in the Brownfield program nowadays, it's more of a working with developers, so parties that are cleaning up contamination, but they didn't cause it, right? They're cleaning it up because they want to redevelop a property. In this case, Ford is the responsible party. Now, it's actually not being managed in the Superfund program specifically, we're following the Superfund process. And the reason I say that it's being managed through the VIC program because the site came into our attention so long ago, back in like 2007, I think it was. And back then we didn't make a distinction in the VIC program between responsible party or not responsible party. And so they've continued to plow forward through participation in VIC. But because Ford is a responsible party, we're applying that Superfund process. And so that's why we have a feasibility study. And that's why we're having these the public meetings and the comment periods, because that is more of the classic Superfund process.
Yeah, let's add a small amount to that. So when we say Superfund is a government program to do these cleanup efforts. Superfund's also a state law and a federal law. There's a liability scheme that spells out who is responsible for contamination and what they have to do. And third, Superfund's also a fund, which is where it got its name from. When it started, it was a very large fund. Doesn't apply to this case, but that fund can be used when there aren't responsible parties available and government has to step in to do the cleanup. Not really the case here. So yes, we very much are following the process. Ford is a responsible party under Superfund. They have the liability, and as Amy said, we're using the process surrounding that to do the investigation and also the cleanup work.
And someone pointed out that the raised hand wasn't working, so thank you very much for pointing that out. We thought it was turned on. You should now be able to raise your hand. So we'll go to one more written question, and then I'll keep monitoring the hand. So thank you again for your patience and letting us turn that on.
Okay. The next one we have is, will the Area C parking area be open to the public after cleanup, or does it remain private?
The parking lot on top of it. So Ford's going to continue to own that, so it will remain private. I believe there are some potential plans for that surface, and this is not something that the MPCA is involved in, but I have heard that there is an energy company that would like to place solar panels on that parking surface, and that energy thus created would go to meet the Highland Bridge's green energy goal. So there is a company that wants to use that surface, and I think it would just be a lease situation because Ford intends to continue to own that property and then would lease that surface to the energy company for the solar panels. That's the only plan I've heard of.
Anyone else? Okay. The next entered question is, it seems that all options except the total removal option mean that the land of Area C will never be accessible to the general public, but will be cordoned off to protect the public from the potential hazards. Is this correct? Even if Ford one day finds a buyer for this land and it changes hands.
So it's going to remain in private property now because Ford owns it and they intend to continue to own it. They probably will continue to have a fence along the property boundary between Area C and Hidden Falls Regional Park, just because a lot of times private property owners want to have a fence that marks the property boundary between their property and the adjacent public land. But that fence isn't going to be necessary for risk management. So hopefully it can be just a more decorative fence and one that's not prone to being cut through as much as the existing chain link fence is. So people can walk along the river and there's a well-established path, along the river that people follow all the time. And so that goes, onto Area C, following along the river. I'm not sure if I answered your question though. Can you read it again, perhaps, Joel?
Yes, I sure can. It seems that all options except the total removal option mean that the land of Area C will never be accessible to the general public, but will be cordoned off to protect the public from the potential hazards. Is
Okay.
this correct? And then even if Ford one day finds a buyer for this land and it changes hands.
Yeah, so property use can change, but there has to be somebody willing to buy it. And that's what our brownfield program does, which is separate, from the Superfund program. In our brownfield program, we work with parties who want to buy contaminated land and put them to a different use, a higher purpose. But that effort is carried forward by somebody who has a plan for that property, and there's a seller and a buyer, and together they figure out some kind of property transfer arrangement, and then the MPCA can work with the prospective purchaser to make sure the cleanup for that new use is suitable and protective. But the state doesn't get involved in land use decisions. Those are the purview of private property owners and local governments.
So in this case, it's Ford's decisions about how they manage the property that does or does not provide public access. Is not what cleanup is decided.
Okay. Next question. My understanding is that in all the plans presented that require monitoring, except 6, the cost estimate of each of those plans includes 30 years of monitoring. Is this correct? How confident are you that the costs of the monitoring of the waste this far out into the future is accurate?
The cost and the feasibility study are just for the sake of comparison, really. It doesn't mean that a party could automatically stop monitoring after 30 years, right? So that's going to be an ongoing evaluation process. I think one thing too I want to mention is about changing circumstance, because nature is dynamic, and we know that with climate change and situations do change. The conditions down there can change, and the inspections and the long-term monitoring help us gauge, if that's happening and if something else needs to be done. So Ford is always going to be a responsible party, so they don't have a get out of jail free card here. So they always have an ongoing responsibility to monitor and deal with problems as they arise. Another example of a situation that might change the circumstances is a potential removal of the lock and dam. And some of you may be familiar with that. Just by way of background, the Army Corps of Engineers is currently evaluating what's going to be the fate of the 3 locks and dams in the Twin Cities, because they're really not used anymore for navigation purposes. So they're currently engaged in a study to figure out what's going to happen with the lock and dam. What's going to happen with that Ford lock and dam? Is it going to stay there even though it's not necessary for navigation? Is the ownership going to transfer from the Army Corps to another public entity or maybe a private entity? Is it going to be removed? And so, or is it going to be maintained and not used for navigation, but maybe used for another purpose, like for recreation or hydropower? And so there's a lot of still uncertainty about the fate of the lock and dam at this point, because the Army Corps of Engineers is pretty early in the process, and there's a lot of avenues to explore before they make a decision about what's going to happen with the Ford lock and dam. But certainly, if at some point the Ford dam is removed, that's going to change the dynamics of the river greatly. And the Army Corps of Engineers would need to evaluate what effect that would have on Area C in terms of erosion or whatever. That's, Area C is very close to the lock and dam. That's why the Army Corps of Engineers put all that sand and debris on Area C when they rebuilt that lock and dam in the late 70s. So that would be a major disruption to the river in that area. The Army Corps of Engineers would be responsible for evaluating that and managing that situation. And that might involve quite a bit more removal, perhaps, of that material at area C, which is okay because the Army Corps of Engineers is who put it there in the first place. The construction fill, that is.
Next question we have, what level of flooding were the two flood events you mentioned relative to the 10-year and 100-year flood levels?
They were definitely 10-year events. Mother Nature did not cooperate. The last 100-year event that we had, I believe, was in 1969.
Next one is, so if no contaminated groundwater discharges to the river, where does it go?
It's just kind of dissipating. All of those wells that were blue dots, which was 19 of the 20, basically have hardly any contamination. I mean, it's just clean. And for comparison, like your local gas station in your neighborhood, if they've had a release from their underground storage tanks, they probably have more groundwater contamination than we're seeing at Area C, or the dry cleaner in your neighborhood. These are businesses that typically have groundwater contamination when there is a release. There's just not a lot of groundwater contamination at Area C. I think it's a combination of the length of time the waste has been there, some flushing of contamination over the years, and the fact that the industrial waste, the majority of the industrial waste is kind of encapsulated with all of this soil and the concrete on top. So it's kind of isolated from the environment under the current condition, except for what's on the south slope. And that is why we want that industrial waste removed from the south slope as much as possible. So in answer to your question, I don't know if I answered that very well, but the groundwater at that south slope right next to the waste is contaminated, but the next set of wells just out from that, further, between that spot and the river, those are clean. So it's just very, very localized.
Okay. Next question. Have there been the consideration that if in the future Ford wants to sell the site, would this approach be sufficient for someone to be interested to purchase the site and develop it for future and a more productive use?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so people can buy and sell their property. That's just a private sector kind of thing. If that does happen, the only thing that could happen there would be if the waste is removed in total, would be restoration to green space, because it's a floodplain and nobody can build anything down there. So it's limited redevelopment, but certainly green space restoration would be the main thing that would happen if the waste was removed in total. And then the MPCA would work with that owner, the new owner, the prospective purchaser, to make sure that the cleanup that is going to be done to support that new use is done correctly and is protective. So that's where we would come in. We would provide that support for a cleanup that would support that new use. We wouldn't get involved in the land use decision in and of itself, but we would support the investigation and cleanup to make that change in land use protective.
Okay. Has Ford indicated how long it will retain ownership after cleanup?
They have not. I think that they are contemplating, and this is kind of hearsay, so don't quote me on it. Again, it's nothing that the MPCA is involved in, but I think that they're perhaps contemplating selling another portion of the river parcel. So Area C is kind of at the south end of the river parcel. On the north end of the river parcel, there's a couple of vacant buildings. One is Ford's previous wastewater treatment plant, and the other is historic steam plant. So those two buildings are currently vacant, and while there can be no new construction down in the floodplain, certainly existing structures can be renovated and reused. So it's possible that Ford might kind of split off that chunk of land and sell that part to somebody who wants to renovate, restore those buildings.
Okay. Since MPCA wasn't able to prevent the pollution of air, land, and water, MPCA's focus, why, if given the choice, wouldn't they completely eliminate this pollution of the land and the water?
Well, we are addressing the pollution that exists that poses a risk. The pollution of the water is very limited, right to the south slope of Area C, the shallow groundwater in that area, and so the alternative 4 does address that. So I'm not quite clear if the person is asking about why we didn't prevent Area C, that waste disposal, to begin with. The MPCA didn't exist at that time, so we weren't around to prevent it. Again, that's kind of a legacy contamination, just the way the companies disposed of their waste at that time.
And I'd like to jump in and follow up there, Amy. I think
Thank you.
we need to apply our regulations consistently across different responsible parties, across our different programs. As a regulator, we have to use the same measuring stick, that same risk-based focus for all of the work that we do. So in this instance, we looked at the risk, we looked at the appropriate response. In an ideal world, yes, we would have no pollution anywhere and we would be able to clean it all up. In a world where we have a regulatory framework and where we need to be consistent, we need to follow our process, treat all of the responsible parties in the same fashion, and make sure that that cleanup matches the risk, or we're going to be out of alignment with programs across our division, across other states, and across EPA. This is just a role that we have to play as regulator.
I did see a hand raised for a moment, but it is now lowered. So again, I'm just monitoring if there are any hands raised. We'll move on to the next typed question since there is no longer a hand raised.
Why isn't there an option between the $8 million option that MPCA prefers and the $71 million option? So, excuse me, $71 million total removal option?
Well, I mean, there could be, but what would it be? You know, we don't look at the cost so much as we look at the action and what is needed to manage the risk. So the main cost for all of these alternatives is, you know, the difference in the cost is the amount of waste that's being removed. A large portion of the cost, you know, the majority of the material is construction fill. You know, I mean, there's a lot more construction fill at Area C than there is industrial waste. So that's expensive to move, and so that's a large portion of the 71 million. I mean, you wouldn't want to take out like more construction fill and then leave the industrial waste. So it's kind of like, I don't know what can be done as a intermediate cost alternative. We don't look at the cost so much as the actions.
Next one. 1 year cleanup process for 3 and 4, but 30 plus years monitoring versus 3 to 4 years of cleanup process, but 0 monitoring afterwards. Longer cleanup, but requires no monitoring and has fullest possibility of use of the land afterwards. Can you comment on that trade-off?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Pam said a few minutes ago. We have a process, that risk-based process, and the cleanup option that we carry forward has to be balanced against that risk, and we need to be consistent in how we apply that process. Pam, did you want to weigh in on that?
No, I would agree with that. We don't look at the dollar amount as Amy has mentioned. We look at that risk framework and what is the appropriate response to mitigate that current risk. And at this site, the risk is very low. And so it doesn't warrant the much larger cleanup project in order to protect human health and the environment.
Okay. Where are the risks mentioned that are attributed to option 6 outlined and described?
Could you repeat that?
Yes. Where are the risks mentioned that are attributed to option 6 outlined and described?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm so sorry.
Like the risks for cleanup.
Do you mean the risks associated with the cleanup itself?
I think that's it, Amy.
Yeah, okay. Well, I don't think they do. I mean, that's something that I don't think the feasibility study does that. That is something that would be included in the design plan. That would be a task that Ford would complete this year for whatever cleanup alternative, because they have to explain how they're going to manage any potential environmental impacts, you know, from the cleanup action itself. And so alternative 6 would be very, it is very disruptive. It's a lot of excavating some very contaminated material, and then even just the construction fill could potentially impact the river in the short term. And now if the environmental impact at the site itself, existing environmental impact warranted such a cleanup, then we would do it. We would require that. But proceeding with a very kind of intensive, intrusive cleanup like that, it has potential environmental risks due to the cleanup itself that really aren't warranted given the limited environmental impact from the contamination that exists. So the environmental impacts that I can think of just off the top of my head here for alternative 6 is just that huge disruption of all the construction fill, the disruption of the industrial waste that would have to be done in phases and then left open, covered as well as possible, but the good cover that currently isolates that waste would be removed for a whole winter, spring season, because the field season in Minnesota for doing cleanups is pretty short, and especially down on the floodplain, it's even shorter. So there'd be a lot of kind of downtime where you couldn't even get at that waste. And in the meantime, the cover would all be gone, and it would just a way. It's just another way that the cleanup itself could have an environmental impact in the short term.
How confident are you that Ford will accept option 4 since they are advocating for option 3?
They know, as you folks know, that the MPCA's chosen alternative is 4, and they have not expressed any opposition to that.
Will Excel proceed with their solar farm if option 3 or 4 is selected?
It's my understanding that they're interested, but again, the MPCA isn't involved in that. I only know about it because I receive questions about the status of Area C, because those parties are interested, you know, because it affects their potential solar plans. So I kind of get hearsay, you know, in terms of that. But as far as I know, there's still interested parties who would like to do that.
A good question for Excel.
Okay. Is there any assurance that deeper waste will not be exposed with future activities?
Future activities. Well, there's not going to be any future activities on that property of Area C. So once the cleanup alternative is completed, there's going to be robust riprap on the slopes. There's going to be an environmental covenant on the property that prohibits any kind of disturbing of that surface. So there wouldn't be any activities going on Area C that would expose that waste. Not unless there was going to be a change in land use and somebody wanted to do additional cleanup to support that new land use.
How are you factoring the future of this site into your decision, i.e. being absorbed by St. Paul Parks, etc.?
Not at all. Not at all, because again, the state does not get involved in land use decisions. If the city of St. Paul wanted to absorb that property, then they would be talking to Ford about how to make that happen, and they would be talking to us about how they could clean that up to make that happen. But that is not a question that's been posed to us, and it's my understanding that that's not going to happen.
I understand you think you've considered the health of humans, but how much have you researched or even considered our other native relatives, plants, pollinators, animals, etc.?
Yeah, well, we look at the risk that's present. So the industrial waste is buried. It's not exposed at the surface, so it's not a concern to people walking on the property. But the same thing goes to animals and pollinators and whatnot. And it's pretty isolated. You know, the majority of the industrial waste is isolated under 40 to 60 feet of sand and concrete and capped by a concrete slab. So our cleanup focus is on that south slope where that's not the case.
Let me just add a little to that. So our role in this process is to use science and data to select cleanup that's protective of both human health and the environment. Both are part of our charge. And that's what we've done in this case.
Okay. What is the legal reason that you are impeded from holding Ford accountable to a full cleanup? If you are following the Superfund process under the Superfund Act, the objective is to reach a permanent solution, which Alternative 4 does not.
Hans, I'll let you answer that.
Yep. So we think Alternative 4 does. That's what our evaluation. I think we have a disagreement in that's built into the question. I want to make sure I'm fully answering this. Can you read the question again?
Yes. What is the legal reason that you are impeded from holding Ford accountable to a full cleanup if you are following the Superfund process under the Superfund Act? The objective is to reach a permanent solution, which Alternative 4 does not.
Okay, so we would probably disagree with you a little bit about what permanent looks like. It doesn't always result in complete removal of all the waste. There can be some solutions that are permanent that don't go to that full extent. In terms of what the legal problems are, it is what our limitations are. Our role is to select cleanup that protects human health and the environment. When we go beyond that, as Pam was saying earlier, we go beyond where we have authority. And that is very problematic for not just one site, but for the whole system generally. That's the reason why we are landing where we're landing. It's because we need to uphold what we're able to do in the system that we have.
And one follow-up to that, I think Amy had described that after this cleanup is completed, we would have an environmental covenant on the property. So that speaks to that permanence piece. As long as the land use on this parcel does not change, that environmental covenant prevents disturbance from happening that would impact the waste that is remaining on site. So that is another tool that we have. It's not a complete removal, but it is a structure that puts limits on the use of that property in order to keep that waste contained.
Yeah. And there's no Superfund site that's cleaned up in total. It's often just not even possible to do. So the cleanups are always risk-based. So enough cleanup is done to manage the risk for the long term. But that doesn't mean that all the contamination is removed.
What happens if conditions change and Ford is out of business or unable to fund cleanup if down the road additional cleanup is later determined to be merited?
Yeah, that's a great question. Hans, would you talk about just the responsible parties under Superfund and what that means in terms of other parties here?
Yeah, so we're applying the legal framework in the Superfund statute, which speaks to who has liability for the cleanup. Ford is one liable party, and that's who we're going after. We only need to go after one party the way the law is set up. It's actually a very potent and effective statute in that way for us. And there are also others. It includes the Corps of Engineers and the City of St. Paul. So there's multiple responsible parties that could be pursued. We're only going after Ford in this case. That's all we need to do. I think what you're pointing out here is actually something that is a concern for us as well on some level. We looked at the possibility of financial assurance to address the concern that you're bringing forth in the question. It's not a thing we're legally able to do. I think, in sort of this worst case scenario you're talking about where Ford would go bankrupt, there's a proceeding they have liability here. And so we'd be in that different arena of how a company's assets are divided up in places where they have liability. It's not a place it's not a place we are very often, so we don't have a whole lot of details to share with you tonight. It is a concern going forward. It's something we're going to keep our eye on. But we feel good about the cleanup that's been selected, even given the concern that you've raised, which has some merit to it.
Yeah. And I would further add that, and if Ford was not in the picture any longer, the Army Corps of Engineers would be in the picture. And they are, as Hans indicated, another responsible party at the site. So there's just more than one pot of money to pursue.
And that segues into, it sounds like you're willing to allow the Army Corps of Engineers clean up Ford Area C if needed, correct me if I'm wrong, but don't want to hold Ford legally responsible now. Why is that?
We are holding them legally responsible now. That's what the process does.
Yeah, it's just about that risk management question. In the future, if conditions change and the alternative of the cleanup needs to be reevaluated because the conditions have changed, then we would pursue whoever was around, if it's Ford, if it's the Army Corps of Engineers, right? But that only happens if the conditions change. And this is how we evaluate all of our contaminated sites. We make a decision based on the current or intended property use for the near future. We make sure the risk is managed for that use. And then if the use changes in the future, the process opens back up again, and we follow the process to manage risk for that new use or to manage risk created by changing conditions. So this is the standard way to evaluate that across all contaminated properties.
I did see a hand raised momentarily. It was put back down. So just a reminder, if you do want to raise your hand, please keep it up and I can call you next. But it's down, so we'll go to another typed question.
Applying regulation consistently seems like the easiest option, but most likely not the most equitable. Has MPCA considered altering their regulatory framework?
I'll jump in on this one. We need to apply our rules, statutes, policies, and guidance the same across all parties that we regulate. If we go outside of that, that puts us in jeopardy for being unevenly going after a regulated party, and will likely end up in the courts to determine if we have overreached what our authorities are. So I would argue that our framework is there for a reason, to make sure that the government is following its rules and regulations and applying them consistently, and we are not in danger of overreach or overburdening the communities that we, or the entities that we regulate.
Okay. Is, quote, cost, unquote, in balancing criteria considered equally for a cleanup like this when Ford is paying versus the state?
It's considered the same. Cost is not the deciding criteria. It's the cost relative to the risk that exists, right? So if there was a significant environmental impact and a really expensive cleanup action was required to address that risk, then that's the action that we would choose, you know, irrespective of the cost. But the problem comes in where it's a minimal environmental impact, and then, you know, the very expensive cleanup just doesn't balance with that. So we don't look at cost as a discrete item, but it's just balanced relative to the risk. But to answer your question, though, you had a question about Ford versus the state. We would handle it the same way. The state would do the risk-based cleanup that that the data calls for, and that's what we would pay for if we were footing the bill.
Are long-term effectiveness and short-term effectiveness weighed equally? Why?
That short-term effectiveness, it's a weird phrase, and I don't think it's a very clear phrase. That short-term effectiveness is what I was talking about in terms of short-term environmental impact during the cleanup action itself. So disturbing of the waste, having contaminated runoff, having contaminated sediment, you know, being washed away by stormwater, greenhouse gases from big trucks going up and down through the neighborhood. That is what short-term effectiveness means. And so it's really a completely different thing than long-term effectiveness, which speaks to the effectiveness of the cleanup itself, the long-term effectiveness of the cleanup. So they're two different things, and all of those things are, I think all of those criteria, those balancing criteria are looked at equally. I don't think any one of them carries the day in terms of making a decision.
Can you talk more about what some short-term potential impacts of cleanup might be?
So if you're digging into contaminated material, you're exposing it to the environment. Now, if it rains or there's snow melt, you're going to get water pooled down there that can cause groundwater contamination, or contaminated stormwater going off-site. And I want to emphasize, though, that when a cleanup action is done, there are standard ways to manage these impacts. It's not like we just get in there and, you know, disturb things and do what may. You know, I mean, there's specific actions that are taken to manage those environmental impacts, but the potential exists for the impact. So contaminated soil and water being strewn about, greenhouse gases, you know, truck exhaust going up and down through the neighborhood, you know, for you know, a whole spring, summer, and fall. Dust, dust, airborne contaminants through dust. So those are the kind of things that we look at.
The main, quote, risk, unquote, at this site is the core toxic waste in the middle of the pile, which won't be touched by alternative 4. Could a more intensive cleanup plan address more of this risk?
Well, that's what we feel alternative 4 is. Alternative 4 gets as much of that industrial waste that's not encapsulated by all that construction fill and underneath the parking lot. So we want to take out as much of that as possible. The industrial waste that's under the 40 to 60 feet of soil in the parking lot is really not posing a risk. I mean, it's not posing a risk to people or to animals or to the river. So that's why we're not pursuing alternative 6. But the industrial waste on the south slope is posing a risk, and that's why we chose alternative 4 to address that area as the focus.
Okay. Next question. So what you are saying about the future of the site is that if an organization, oops, sorry, we've hit that one already. How are you defining the environment when you say there's minimal environmental impact? It sounds like the water has been impacted and the land is still being impacted. Buried within is still impact.
Could you read that again, Joel?
Yeah, how are you defining the quote environment unquote when you say there is minimal environmental impact? It sounds like the water has been impacted and the land is still being impacted. Parentheses, buried within is still impact. I believe they mean
Okay.
impacted.
So one thing in the risk, when we look at environmental risk, the mere presence of something doesn't mean it's a risk. And so this is kind of a key point about risk assessment. There can be contamination present, but if it's not posing a risk, then it's not a problem. And so that's kind of the core principle of our risk-based framework that we use to make decisions. We know that there's contamination present. Much of it is buried beneath 40 to 60 feet of construction fill and a parking lot over it. It's not accessible to anybody. It's not causing groundwater contamination. So we know it's there, yes, but it's not posing a risk. On the south slope, we know it's there, but we have identified a risk, both to a potential risk to people because the waste is close to the surface, and to groundwater, at least in that localized area. So that's why we chose alternative 4 to address that area.
Okay. How would you be alerted to the need for a new evaluation because of new land use with a new owner?
Yeah, there's checks and balances when it comes to buying and selling contaminated property. And so the prospective purchaser would almost certainly reach out to us. So first of all, there's going to be an environmental covenant on the property as well, which has a legal requirement for us to be notified if there is a new owner. But even irrespective of that, just the market for buying and selling land has these checks and balances that kind of channel people into our mnpca remediation programs so that we can help them kind of navigate that change in land use and whatever additional cleanup is needed to support that new use.
Okay. We've got another question, which I think we addressed in another version of the same question. So what you are saying about the future of the site is that if an organization like St. Paul Parks wanted to buy the land, you would support a full cleanup for that land use purpose.
That's correct. That's correct. So our role is to provide assistance for investigation and cleanup to manage risk for the current condition and any planned change in land use. So if somebody wants to buy that property and they say, I want to buy this property and I want to get rid of all that waste and I want to restore it to its natural condition, then we would say, hey, we'll work with you on that cleanup plan, because that's what you that's a change in land use that you want to accomplish. So we provide support services, I guess I would say, for dealing with contamination that's present when on contaminated properties when they're being repurposed for other uses. But that's all driven by sellers and buyers. It's not driven by the state.
Thank you all for all the wonderful questions. We are getting towards the end of our question time, so I want to give a moment if there are some final questions. I'll just give a few moments for anyone to type or raise their hand before we go into closing remarks.
We do have one. It sounds like you're giving your trust to Ford's words/intention and basing your decisions off of that information. Why trust a company who created all of this pollution in the first place?
Yeah, I don't know that I agree with that. So Shauna and myself, Shauna introduced herself earlier in the presentation here. So we're both licensed geologists. We've been working in remediation sites for a good 30 years. We don't just take what Ford says and accept that as the truth. You know, we review all those reports. We were in the field when the field work was being done, when the drilling was being done, when the trenching was being done. We were out there looking with our own eyes and seeing what was uncovered. And we evaluate all the reports. So we look at all the laboratory data, including the quality assurance, quality control, to make sure it's all above board. So that's just our job. I mean, that's why we're here. So we don't take anybody's word for it. We draw our own determinations, our own decisions, you know, based on our professional experience and our review and our field experience.
I'll just add that same level of oversight and protection and continues through the cleanup. It doesn't end here. It continues through the cleanup and also in the monitoring after the cleanup.
All right, I do see a hand raised by Lisa, so I will unmute you and you can ask your question. So give me 1 second to unmute you here. And you lowered your hand. Okay. Okay. Let's see.
Sorry, technical difficulties.
That's okay.
Thank you for answering my question. I think my question was, that's this follow-up to the trusting Ford, is not necessarily about the studies they've done and like the third parties they've hired. It's more about this idea that they say they're not going to sell their property and that they're going to be, you know, overseeing this site for 30 years or whatever it is. It just seems like those are just words to me. I mean, they can say anything they want. And so I'm just wondering, how much are we allowing them to just, or how much are we basing our decisions off of what they're just saying in those types of instances?
Yeah, but we've got some teeth to that though. So that environmental covenant that we talked about, that's an institutional control. It's a legal document that imposes restrictions and affirmative obligations, required actions on the property owner. And part of that is annual reporting to the MPCA. So there, pardon me?
And land use restrictions.
And land use restrictions as well. Yeah, thank you, Shauna. So this is a legal document that has very specific restrictions and actions and requirements in it that Ford would have to meet in the interim or in the short term, but any future property owner as well, because that legal document, institutional control, goes with the land, and so whoever owns it is subject to that, even if the property use, if the property ownership changes, then those obligations go to that new owner as well, unless additional cleanup is done to remove some of those restrictions and actions. So that's the process that we use to ensure ongoing inspections, maintenance, and monitoring. And we're looking for those inspection reports and monitoring reports to come to us. We we review that and make sure everything stays on the up and up. Does that answer your question?
Sort of. I have a hard time just because I'm just not satisfied with the decision, but that's just my own opinion.
Yeah, I understand.
All right, I don't see any more typed questions. So I'm going to start with our closing for tonight. Thank you again, everyone, for sharing your questions, for participating, being part of this meeting. We really appreciate you all being here. As it was mentioned earlier, this meeting is being recorded and we're going to post it on the Board Area C webpage on mnpca's website. So if you know people in your community or others who weren't able to join this meeting or join the in-person, feel free to let them know that this recording will be available. And we've talked about the website or the webpage before, but that is your one-stop shop, so to say, of finding background information, more information about Ford Area C and the history. You can also find the Minnesota Department of Health assessment from 2020, the feasibility study, as well as the link to the public comment. Again, that public comment period ends on February 3rd, 2026. So please make sure that you submit your comment through the online form or by mail. What was shared today, the questions aren't part of the public comment, so you do need to go and submit that if you would like to be part of that public comment period. And the last slide we have here is our contact information for Amy and myself. So if you have additional questions or you want to reach out at any point, please feel free to contact us. Amy is the person to go to for any questions related to the environmental investigation, remediation, or cleanup. And if you have general questions or questions related to community affairs, please feel free to reach out to me.